My next guest is best known as the lead singer for one of the Earth's finest rock bands, Avenged Sevenfold. And it's been a minute since he and I have had a chance to chat. M. Shadows of Avenged Sevenfold. Matt, it's great to see you. How are you?
Oh, it's great to see you. I'm doing better now. Now that I'm seeing you in person, it's been a while.
Well, you know what? Maybe that's where we pick up the story first, because the last I saw you was towards the end of the tour cycle for the stage. And even by Avenged standards, I think that was a really, maybe the word grueling isn't correct, but it was definitely a physically very involved tour cycle for you guys. And I knew that you were in for a long break after that. So what was the mindset coming out of that? And, after all the exertion on that?
Yeah, I mean that whole tour cycle was really, I wouldn't say it was fumbled, but the fact that we went and did the Metallica Stadium tour in the middle of all that really just kind of threw us out of our sort of groove. We had a bunch of plans, and we kind of were like, okay, we're going to go to Europe first, then we're going to come over to the States and do this whole thing. And then we got the call from Metallica. And at first we weren't sure if we were going to do that. And then we thought about it for a while, and we said, no, we're going to go do this. We're going to do the Metallica thing, and then we're going to come back to our, regularly scheduled programming and get back on tour. And at some point it was just too much for the voice, too much. And it was actually, a lot of it was the Metallica tour, doing 1 hour sets, even though it wasn't very long. It was a very strenuous, no ballads, straight to the point, no, time for guitar solos. And it really took a toll on me. And, we just weren't ever really able to go pick it back up again. You kind of got to look at this as a long game sort of thing. And we didn't. We kind of we thought we could kind of just bulldoze our way through. And so by the end of it, we were pretty beat up and we were kind of over it, and so we did take a very long break. And it was also, the time in our lives where, we're at the age now where most people kind of blink and wake up one morning and you look back and you go, whoa, where did it all go? And you start trying to reevaluate and put different priorities in place. And whether that's family, whether that's leisure, whether it's doing other things, and kind of all those things snowballed into this sort of thing that we have now, which is, come back when you're ready, come back when you're energized, come back when you have something to say, but don't worry about being in the grind of the rock and roll kind of thing. So all that sort of happened. And yeah, the stage, we didn't really ever get to do the American tour the way we wanted to. So it's kind of one of those things we left on the field, unfortunately, but now we're picking it back up, and hopefully we can tap into some of that stuff coming up here.
The shows that you did get to do, those indoor arena shows, were fantastic, although they were probably the longest performances I've ever seen you guys do. And I've been going to see you since you were, a little baby band. That was a pretty long night, I think.
Yeah. Everything was, those are long songs. We've always had long songs. And then you want to, make sure you get enough new stuff in, and you want to play the old stuff. And it's, one of those things where, you throw in a little piece of heaven and it's 9 minutes, and you throw in Buried Alive and it's 7 minutes, and you throw in, people want to hear Save Me, and that's 11 minutes, and they want to hear Exist, and that's 15. It's like, it gets really hard because, you're really picking and choosing those battles, and we may have bit off a little more than we could chew, or we didn't space it out correctly. But those shows actually were easier for me than the Metallica shows. Honestly, the 1 hour of straight, yelling in that sort of F sharp, G, A, B area where we kind of write a lot of our stuff because it's in, D minor a lot of the times. That really will take a toll. And once you kind of have a little bit of an injury kind of forming, it's kind of like, asking a basketball player to, that has a hamstring injury, to go out there every night and keep playing and not take days off. And it gets a little crazy. So, we've kind of learned some lessons.
We're going to come back to that in a little bit as we talk about the new record. But if you could, and without getting too deep in the weeds here, talk a bit more about the time during the break and the, I refer to the pandemic era as the recent unpleasantness. So
Yeah.
you guys are already sort of baked in to take a long break, and then the world essentially shuts down, goes crazy, everything that was going on where you are in Huntington Beach. I know that was a hot spot for a lot of protests and a lot of sickness. And how did that all sort of work into the record and the timeline that you ended up on?
Yeah, it's interesting because it seemed like one thing after another with world events. And obviously that takes precedent over, certain things. And also then when you wanted to do certain things, you couldn't because the world was kind of shut down or things were happening, right? So one example would be, we kind of wrote a lot of the record probably a year after we were off. I was working on vocal issues with different vocal coaches and doctors and trying to get through that, but also writing, with the mindset that it was going to be fine, but it was going to take a while, but let's write this record. So we wrote a bunch of stuff. Then we had the Black Lives Matter stuff happen, and we were trying to get in to do drums, and we were doing drums in LA. And it just happened that those few weeks that we had booked were when all these protests were going on, and we couldn't actually get into the studio. The police wouldn't let us. We had COVID going on. We had all these shutdowns and on and off. And so then you basically had this really convoluted, like, when can we get in? When can we not? What studio is going to let us do what? Oh, we booked this studio. They won't allow us to do the things we need to do to get this record done. And so it just kept getting rebooked and rebooked. Finally, we just like took another year off because it was really frustrating and it wasn't feeling conducive. It wasn't feeling like cohesive, is I guess what would be the right word. We had things like, yeah, you can get 78 string players, but they can't sit next to each other. And I know Joe Breezy had just gone through that with another band, and he said all the intonation was off. He had to redo all the strings anyway, so we waited on that. We just kept punting things. And then eventually we just took a year off and said, okay, we're just not going to even touch this until we can come back to it. So then we did that, and we thought we had a few months left. Turns out we had another year left. So we get in there and we start working on it again. And we're like, and now we have like all these new ideas because it's been a year. And so we start redoing things and doing things differently. And then we, then fast forward to going to Andy Wallace, and he's like, yeah, he's 75 now. And he's like, yeah, I work, no weekends, and I work like maybe a week and a half at a time. And so then we have him going on vacation to, to his house in Florida, and then he's going on road trips. And so we're just kind of, but through all that, we really learned to like let it go and to not worry about it and to just kind of be in the moment, be present, and like, it's going to get done when it gets done. Just do the right steps. And when you get to the promised land, you're going to have a product that you're really proud of. And so through all that stuff, that's a long, convoluted answer to a very interesting time in American history or world history. But that's what we were going through. And but we learned a lot about ourselves in that amount of time.
I would be curious because it certainly sounds like the sound of this record was in some ways at least indirectly affected by all of this stuff that went on. I think it's an extra important point because you guys have always had different genres mixed in with your sound. It's one of the things that has made Avenged Sevenfold so interesting, but you're certainly wearing some of your prog rock influences on your sleeves this time. At least that was my take from my listens to the record. Tell me about the entire sound of this album, which really covers a lot of ground.
Yeah. So we were just looking for really bold moments in life, in art, in film, things that we could sort of wrap our minds around an audio representation of how we were feeling about certain things. And at this point, playing around with melody, playing around with tones, playing around with left turns, curveballs was really appealing to us. I think we've proven to everyone, whether they like the band or not, that we kind of know the rules of music. And this record, we were able to just go break all the rules. And the way, Mike Shinoda put it to me really perfectly. And I love his insight on a lot of things. And he said, this record is like you guys throwing paint at the wall. But if a fourth grader was doing it, you'd say that's just paint on the wall. But because of the everything you've done before, we all know you know how to make a beautiful painting. So this record is actually really special because it's not just paint on the wall. You guys have broken all the rules and done things in an abstract way that, but we want to listen and pay attention because we know what you guys have done before. And I thought it was an interesting way of putting it because, you know, those guys have been a big fan of it. Like Dave and Mike have been big fans of this record. And I think that was a cool way of putting it. We kind of just really wanted to push the boundaries, the musical boundaries, the lyrical boundaries, the themes. And we didn't want anything on the record to sound generic or phoned in or not exciting, right? Like we wanted to redo everything we've ever done, where even the song lengths and the way we kind of put these little pieces of ear candy, but we get away from it quick, or staying away from 3 choruses, or if there is 3 choruses, they're all vastly different, right? Like, and really like thinking about turning the traditional landscape of how you would normally put a song together on its head, but doing it in an interesting way, not just to do it, but just to do it in a way that we think people will enjoy and give them some sort of reason to get to the end of songs or get to the next song on the record. And I think that was just the mindset this time, was just a little different, you know, really looking at those things.
Yeah, one of the things I found most interesting about the record, and each time I listened to it completely, beginning to end, and I believe it ties into what you were just talking about. There are very interesting, sometimes short, sometimes very quiet interludes in between the records or inside of particular songs, and that mixed in with the way the album was sequenced really gives it a very great dynamic range.
Yeah, there's a lot of dynamic range. And I think it starts with everything from the production, right? So everything on it is real, right? There's a lot of vocoder on it. It's a real vocoder. It's not a plugin. There's no vocal effects. It's very dry unless we want there to be a vocal effect, right? Like a drastic sort of thing. The drums are all real. There's no sampled drums. There's nothing layered in. 808s and all the hip hop production we did ourselves. Like we really crafted those things. We didn't just take it from a sound library. And then you have Andy Wallace mixing. We make sure he's mixing what we give him, not sound replacing anything. And then you go to Bob Ludwig and we keep the dynamic range so that these things can pop and they can hit in ways that if you brick wall everything, you're not going to get any of that, right? You can really fumble the ball on the 1 yard line. And I think but just we would never know this stuff if we didn't have 23 years of doing this before, right? We've made mistakes and we've seen things that we thought were so great that get ruined by the end, or different. And dynamic range and like these sort of jump scare moments, or these moments that have to go low and go high, and that is so exciting, and it's missing a lot in music these days. And I don't want to. It's not my job to go, and I can just only speak for us. And those are important things to us. And I'm glad you heard it, because even from the mastering perspective, we had him lowering stuff and raising stuff and doing these things to really make sure that things felt like a roller coaster and not, you know, kind of a brick wall of noise. I think, but it's missing a lot nowadays. And sometimes people think it's a flaw, right? Like they go like, why isn't it as loud as this? Or why doesn't the production sound like this? And it's like, well, because this is all real. And it's, you're not used to that, right? You're just not used to that. We're used to hearing the same drums get pulled from the same sample libraries, and we're used to hearing the same everything. And when you hear something different, you're really not sure if you like it or not sometimes.
Well, you know, and I think that gets to the heart of what I mentioned earlier, how it sort of has in certain passages, in certain parts of some songs, like an old school prog rocky sort of things, you know, Rush came to ear, One Size Fits All era, Frank Zappa and the Mothers came to mind with the sort of dynamic range in there. And I have to ask, because you mentioned instrumentation, did I in fact hear a real Meltron in there any place, maybe in Game Over?
Oh, it's all real. Yeah, it's a real, you actually hear we hit such a low note on it that the tapes are warbling. You can hear it in the right speakers.
Yeah.
You hear so all that stuff is real. We brought everything in. Brian learned every instrument on the record that's not a part of the orchestra. So he learned flute. He plays the piano on the very last track, taught himself that. Took him about 6 to 8 months. He learned the harmonica. He beatboxes at the end of Mattel. He just went all in on like learning everything so that no one else had to come in and play. The flute was the funniest one because he's just like, this, we picked the one note I got to play that just does not, like, and just freaking out, but he'd sit there all day. And so, yeah, everything, yeah, it's all real. Meltron's real. Yeah.
Were you there for the Meltron stuff getting done? And the reason I bring this up, it's a fairly obscure instrument that I'm a huge fan of. They are very ornery to deal with if it's a real old school Meltron. Any memories from using that in the studio?
Yeah, there was, we had to redo the tapes a couple times because things weren't working right. I know when they come in, right? We brought a couple of them in. They're hard to find. We had the best guy in LA bring him in. Brian probably sat there. I think we had it for 2 weeks and we just kind of kept trying new parts on it. And then the biggest story was that warble, right? Because that note would not work no matter what we did. And then we said, well, that's kind of rad. That's fucking awesome. Like the warble is like, that's how people are going to know this is real. Like like the note hits and it's just like, oh, and it's out of tune for a second, but to me, that's beautiful, right? It's like, this is the best Meltron we're going to get. This is real. We're not going to replace it. We're not going to get a higher note and then tune it down. We're just going to leave it. So that's a little, Easter egg. When people listen back, they can hear the very end of Game Over. You will hear in the right speaker, the Meltron phase in and out for a second, but that's because of the tape.
The first big smile I had listening to the album was at the end of Game Over, and I heard the Meltron, and I'm like, I know what that is.
Yeah.
That's a real Meltron. Because again, I heard the imperfection in it, whereas the newer ones, the sampled ones, they don't really have that. It's a very particular sort of error, which is the beauty of why you use a real one. But so on to sequencing the record. Tell me about putting this whole thing together, because it, more so than any other record, maybe for you guys, it must have been a real puzzle piece to make this all fit together correctly.
Well, we had a lot of, even though we are going for more concise and more, we felt that more concise and more left turns and is kind of, but you don't want to, one thing that was going to bum us out is if we had 8-minute songs and there was like one left turn in there, right? Like, it's like, okay, but there's a lot of filler there. So we were really trying to cut these things down to get like moment after moment. And when we would get any sort of like anxiety or boredom, this is a different philosophy for us. Like, it was like, we'd kind of cut these things down. And so at the end of it, I think there was a couple other songs that were in the running, but they just seemed to drag the record down. And in terms of like, they had like maybe 1 foot a little too far in the past, or they were a little bit more generic's not the right word, but they're a little more normal. Then we started going all in on this idea that we wanted this thing to be, and it was a little bit influenced by, to be honest, actually Kanye put out a record. It was like his Jesus record, where he went all full Jesus. But what was interesting about it is the songs almost felt unfinished. They felt like they would quickly start and there was these great ideas, and then they'd stop and then they'd move on to the next thing. And the record was like barely 30 minutes, something like that. And I was like, of course, online, that was like the big, like, oh, these songs are unfinished. This is crap. But I put it on one day and I was like instantly back to the first track again. I was like, that was such a like breath of fresh air of an experience. Like, I was never bored. I was never like, oh, these are the new songs I can't get. It just rolled in a way that I just felt like, what a refreshing thing. And so part of the idea on this record was to keep things really fresh and not really get too bogged down by any certain idea for too long. And obviously there are weightier songs like A Nobody or Cosmic, or We Love You, but I think they move enough in the vicinity of where they're playing, the kind of sonic template they're playing with, that they still keep you interested. So a little bit of the influence was like sporadic left turns, even with the track listing. Like, these things need to move in a way that it doesn't feel like a chore to listen to. It's almost like, well, what's next? okay, they did that on that. Like, what's coming next? So kind of really cutting things down. And then God was really influenced by a Travis Scott song called Sicko Mode. And that song always blew me away because not only was it is one of his biggest songs, but it's like 3 songs in one, and it just shifts. And so you could look at like Abbey Road or artists that have done it before in rock, but then this hip hop way they did it was an even more concise way and even more drastic with the cuts. Again, breaking rules in a way that people don't expect. So we kind of took influence from that and said, well, we can do that. We can cut songs in the middle of them and shift gears. And so that was kind of fun to play with because I haven't heard many rock bands really mess with that kind of thing. I think it's a modern approach. I think it's kind of cool. And so yeah, putting this together was all about keeping attention, right? Like, where are you going next? What are we doing? And not getting too bogged down.
And if you would speak a little bit about your vocals, because you're doing some stuff that I don't think I've ever heard you do before. I would be curious if some of it came out of the fact that you took vocal coaching and you had your voice looked after professionally, which has helped a number of other people I've known before to keep them from shredding themselves.
Yeah. So I had always been going with Ron Anderson for a long time. And I think my vocal approach on most records has been like on 10 all the time. Right. Like this, but with that comes like a little bit of a snarl, a little bit of a whininess, maybe that doesn't necessarily represent my talking voice as much. Ron ended up dying a few years ago, and going through this vocal issue, everyone's like, you got to go to Seth Riggs. You got to see Seth Riggs, and he does, Stevie Wonder and Brian Wilson and Michael Jackson. Like it's more of the only rock guy he does was Chester. And Chester's awesome, right? Like, so I was like, I'll go talk to Seth. So I go to Seth and his wife, Margareta, and they are fucking I'm sorry for cussing. I don't know if I'm allowed to on this. They are so dialed in, right? Like on how to correctly do all these things, like in a different way. And so I've been with them for a few years now, and it did help in a way to where I could express myself more colorfully, I guess, in a more proper way instead of always being on 10 all the time. And I think it took a lot of the whininess out of my voice. Things that a lot of fans probably like, and and people that aren't fans don't like. But there's a more seriousness and a weight to it on this record. And I think it's interesting. And what I like about it is with the freedom to make the music you want to make, and what we were talking about earlier, I think it's cool to have a vocal shift too, right? So Brian's reworking how his guitar sounds and how he wants to play solos. Brooks is reworking how he wants to do drums. We're working on the whole sound. Like, we're crafting this thing and not being constrained to the past. And to be able to come in with a fresh palette and go, okay, here's all the things that we can do vocally, and then not worrying about if it checks the boxes of the old records. The old records exist. That's great. And so on this record, we just tried so many things, so many, toys that Joe Breezy's got there, singing through like little kid toys from Toys R Us to singing through 5 amps that are amped up in a live room to get screaming techniques. And we just tried so many things, and we just kept the things that sounded the most unique to us. And we weren't worried about, trying to sound like old Avenged Sevenfold.
We are almost out of time. The time has gone too quickly. I must ask you one last thing with the return to the road. Tell me about making tickets available to Avenged Sevenfold fans in a way that won't make them miserable, unhappy.
Well, we're trying to do a couple things, right? And so with the rise of blockchain technology, and all the baggage that comes along with, that, if you actually look at the underlying tech, there's a lot of things that could be possible use cases for ticketing. And I think because we've been building out for so long, we got the ear of Rapino and David Marcus and all the people over at Ticketmaster and Live Nation, and they decided to go in on this venture with us to try and authenticate tickets and the buying process through the blockchain. And so for people that don't know what that is, basically imagine a database that holds your American Airlines rewards program, right? And the idea is that the more you fly on American Airlines, they can help you with hotels, they can upgrade you to first class, they can do all these things for you. Well, you can kind of do that by using the blockchain in a way that, you know, if you buy merch or if you're listening to us on Spotify, if you're going to shows, we can kind of track that. We can definitely track that on the blockchain. And then we can reward those people later on with tokens that allow them to buy tickets earlier than everyone else. The idea being that we know real fans are getting the tickets and that it's not going to scalpers and bots and people that just want to flip, you know, anything in this world. If you can make money on it, people will try. So our biggest thing is trying to protect the biggest fans and allow them to get tickets first at the reasonable prices instead of buying resales. So for instance, I saw SZA went on sale today, who's a pop artist. And I was looking at the tickets and, you know, crypto.com sold out, or Staples Center, to people that don't know, it switched over, sold out in like 30 seconds. And I went on Ticketmaster and there's over 45% of those are already on resale. So to me, if you're her fan and you're stuck in a queue, and then these bots who are professionals and these scalpers, resellers, get them instantly. And even if you're a fan, you might want to resell it if the price goes up. And you instantly are reselling those back to the fan who's now paying 5, 6, 10x what the price is. It would be nice to figure out a way to protect the people that are participating in your ecosystem constantly. And that's what we think we've kind of figured out. Now we're running a beta right now. And that's kind of a long, convoluted answer because these are kind of nuanced, convoluted problems. But we are trying to figure it out because we think it's much more valuable for an artist to be trying to figure out these solutions to these problems instead of always letting the VCs and the people that are trying to make all the money off us or off of the fans, having them try to figure out the problem. You're going to get a much different result than if an artist goes in there and says, well, this is what we're going to do. So that's what we're doing.
That's fascinating. And we're going to pick it up with that again the next time we have a chance to speak. But I'm so glad to see you guys back in action again. And I will see you for the opening of the tour in Camden.
Awesome. Great to see you, dude.
Great to see you too. M Shadows from Avenged Sevenfold.